think they're mutually reinforcing elements, and the one gives credence and validation to the other and says, this is right because we are operating to advance God's will in the world. Um, it's an area that it's just very interesting. I come from, my grandfather and father were both Presbyterian ministers. I was ordained as an elder in the Presbyterian Church. I left the church in I guess, the late 80s in large part because of the drift to the right and the feeling that I had that there wasn't really a place in that institution anymore for me as it became more and more kind of, drifting to the right, if you will. And I have a couple thoughts. One is I can't remember which which blog post, but let's say I think it's the third post. I referenced a discussion that Ross Douthat, who's a New York Times correspondent, who was like more kind of middle right and has gone kind of more extreme, but also is a very strong Christian. And an interview that he had with a woman who comes out of that tradition, and you're really struck by the number one, the clarity, right? They have such a clarity of their analysis and their rationale and their thinking. When you listen to this interview, I couldn't help but be impressed with how thoughtful and just clear she was in her conversation with Douthat. And so I think we need to recognize that with that kind of Christian faith comes a level of certainty that is very kind of dangerous because there's not, in my tradition, it's much more a posture of inquiry, reflection, awe. It's much less a conviction of righteousness, if you will. Um, and so I think there's a very strong part of this that can feed the authoritarian energy that comes out of then the Christian nationalist frame. I would also point you to a lecture that Timothy Schneider, the historian, gave at New York Public Library. And again, you'll find a link to this in the discussion that I have talking about Timothy Schneider and Hannah Arendt as kind of two parts of a whole in terms of thinking about tyranny and fascism. And that I can't remember the full title, but it starts as being called, his talk is called The New Paganists. And he pulls this all back to paganist religious tradition and kind of talks through kind of what that means. And it's very funny because the talk begins in a very, very academic plane. And it's only when he gets to the question and answer period that all of a sudden you start saying, like this is exactly how it connects to the day and to MAGA. But one of the things that he talks about is the notion within pagan traditions of sacrifice. And that in paganism, you're sacrificing animals, you're sacrificing, in some cases, individuals. And there's this idea that, in fact, the community should sacrifice for the god. And I was really struck by this because I listened to that talk around the time when Trump was making comments about how little girls will have to go from having 30 dolls to 3 dolls, or we're going to have to tighten up our belt. And this is just what's going to be required for us to get to where we're trying to go in terms of the policies and administrative goals that they were pursuing. And it was just striking to me to think about that notion of sacrifice. And when you listen to some of the interviews with ranchers and farmers and others, there is this, on the one hand, an acknowledgement that, through the tariff process and system, they are being kind of, not their interests are not necessarily being advanced, and that they are being, for lack of a better word, punished. You think about the Argentine kind of beef importing and what that means for American ranchers. I mean, all these kind of things. And yet there is still this sense of a lack of outrage on their part and a lack of feeling betrayed or a lack of, gosh, he doesn't represent our interests. Instead, it's this, well, that's part of the price we have to pay for, fixing what the Democrats did kind of thing. And so it's a really interesting kind of way to have to think about this and try to understand it in order to get behind it enough to say, how do we engage and respond, in a different way going forward?